Dmitri Shostakovich was the greatest composer of all time. He was a voice of those who couldn't speak, a fighter against tyranny, and a storyteller of his time. Living through oppressive rule, he created music that captured millions' struggles, fears, and hopes. Shostakovich lived in one of the darkest periods of history, where speaking out against the government could mean imprisonment, or even worse. Each piece he wrote was like a diary, filled with emotions that couldn't be expressed openly. He once described life as unbelievably mean and hard. Every day brought more bad news, and I felt so much pain. I was lonely and afraid. For a while, his music was banned, never to be played, yet Shostakovich fought back. Shostakovich wrote 15 symphonies, breaking the so-called curse of the ninth that stopped many composers before him. Shostakovich was deeply affected by this political and artistic repression by the government. Many of his works received criticism, banned, or suppressed. He often provided an image of his life in his symphonies or his string quartets, and they are full of despair and pain and are dark and haunted. He would often use an oboe or flute solo in his pieces as if depicting a lone voice. His voice captured both his personal and political turmoil of his time. For example, Symphony No. 11 tells the story of Bloody Sunday, where peaceful protesters were massacred. The repeated F-sharp notes, snare drums, timpani, and other percussion instruments depict the gunshots and is interpreted as the footsteps of the soldiers. His 7th Symphony, written in the Siege of Leningrad, is another masterpiece. It symbolized hope during the World War II, performed by starving musicians in the city under attack. The triumphant ending reminded people that there is still hope even in the darkest times. Let's talk about Shostakovich's first opera, one of the most comical opera I've ever witnessed in my entire life, and it is called The Nose. Yes, you heard me right. The Nose. It's crazy. One scene was really funny, but I watched a scene from the opera where noses started tap dancing. People dressed up in nose costumes tap dancing. And I recommend you go watch it. It's truly absurd, but it's an absurd and nightmarish story about a government official living in St. Petersburg who wakes up with a missing nose that runs away from his face to start a life on his own, and the poor man has to find ways to live life normal. This is a work of satire written from 1927, and he was very young when he wrote this. He was at the age of 21 to 22, and this is when he wrote his first opera. And can you just imagine that? It's crazy. Shostakovich's spin on this funny story was much darker than the original. The original had more surrealistic, fantasy-like aspects, but Shostakovich wrings out the work and intensifies the grotesque and political aspects of it. The music was also untraditional. It was hard to the ear, military-like, similar to fanfares. And the opera had mixed reviews. It was too absurd, satirical, experimental, and probably they weren't too pleased about the topic, a literal official losing his nose. But the opera would be forgotten, not performed again in the Soviet Union until 1974. That is that's over 50 years after it was first performed. Move on to another opera, Lady Macbeth of Mistake, Shostakovich's silenced opera. It talks about a merchant wife, unhappy in the marriage, falling in love with a worker, who didn't even treat her right, to be honest. Come on now. But was driven to murder. There's a lot of violence, coercion, and passion in this opera, which may explain why the government wanted to censor it. The wife in the opera is seen as a strong, complex, sympathetic modern woman manipulated by the men in her life. An anti-hero, you could say. A figure that is in the moral gray that people can relate to. It shows the ugly side of women who were living in 19th century Russia. Initially, the opera was very well received. It showed real and relevant aspects of being human, love and death, friendship and betrayal. And it should have remained appreciated and expressed. People should have had an opportunity to make a connection with this opera. But, as they always say, things just have to go wrong. On January night in 1936, the work was about to have a second production. But it was rumored that Stalin would be in the audience. Perhaps he was drafting a new criteria for the socialist realism, doing a little checkup. Who knows? And this wasn't great news because the Soviet Union saw feminism as a threatening concept. A few days after Stalin walked out of the performance, Pravda, the official newspaper of the Soviet Union, came out with an editorial, Muddle instead of music, describing the work as an insult to the Soviet people. It was coarse, primitive, and vulgar, because obviously talking about domestic violence and women in Russia is now vulgar now, I see. It was clear in the newspaper that unless Shostakovich, the author of this, quote, degenerate opera, changed his ways, things would end very bad. the piece would be banned. Shostakovich's approach on the realistic life of women living in the Soviet Union was banned. He was called the, quote, enemy of the people. His career was majorly affected because no one wants to commission a composer that the government hated. It just doesn't make sense. His plans to premiere his just completed Fourth Symphony was just shelved. He would never finish another opera. At the age of 26, he was shunned by almost everyone he knew. The same year, many of his closest friends and relatives were imprisoned or executed. He never finished another opera after that, but the work still stands as a powerful example of his courage. Stalin wanted music to glorify himself in the Soviet Union, but Shostakovich had other plans. His Fifth Symphony was composed in an atmosphere of terror in Russia, forced labor camps in Siberia, and brutal ends of the feared secret police. Shostakovich knew that he had to take this chance to redeem himself, and he would do it without sacrificing his art and sacrificing his voice. Let's talk about the Fifth Symphony. To analyze the music a little bit, it opens up dark, dramatic sounding, and it's very harsh and terrifying, full of despair, and we all know what Shostakovich is about. That's the signature Shostakovich music. In the finale, it's very expressive. It's composed in a bold D major, so there's a lot of juxtaposition in here. Shostakovich described it as, quote, the rejoicing is forced, created under threat. Stalin was happy. He thought Shostakovich was glorifying him, but he didn't realize Shostakovich's true intent. Hilariously, the newspaper, they dubbed it a constructive, creative answer of Soviet artists to well-deserved criticism. Like he was, quote, learning from their mistakes. And Stalin never realized Shostakovich's true intention. In 1941, Shostakovich poured the anguish of World War II and the resilience of humanity into his Seventh Symphony, which is known as the Leningrad Symphony. This monumental work captured the devastation and defiance of the city under siege. Written in 6 months, the symphony begins with a deceptive, serene melody that grows into a relentless, ominous march. The, quote, invasion theme uses repetition and orchestration to kind of mirror the steady, crushing advance of an enemy. Shostakovich masterfully weaves moments of silence and resurging climaxes, showing the resilience of the human spirit even in its darkest hours. Posters were put up to recruit anyone who could play an instrument, and rehearsals were grueling. The concert was broadcasted live on radio while fighting the Nazis. The Soviets fought back and drove the Germans westward of the city's outskirts, ending the siege. A German general listened to the symphony as well, and he later said, when it finished, I realized that never shall we be able to enter Leningrad. It is not a city to be conquered. At the end, what's very interesting about the end is that the symphony's triumph C major conclusion, a single side drum returns. It's very quiet but persistent, as if to remind us that tyranny and evil, a reference to Stalin's leadership, are truly never gone. The music does not shy away from the truth. It acknowledges the lurking shadows even amidst victory. Shostakovich expressed his hope through music that one day tyranny would fail and humanity could live freely without fear or repression. His symphonies remain masterpieces that inspire millions to this day, showing the triumph of art over oppression. But his joy was short-lived. In 1948, Stalin targeted him again. Shostakovich was once loved by Stalin. The newspapers loved him, but Stalin fell back into distrust. A decree labeled Shostakovich, along with Prokofiev and Khachaturian, as enemies of the state for writing music that didn't align with Soviet ideals. He lost his teaching position, his music was banned, and he faced public ridicule. He was fearing arrest, and Shostakovich had to keep a packed suitcase ready and often slept in the stairwell to spare his family the trauma of seeing him taken away, living in this constant fear that one day he would have to leave his family forever. But why? Wasn't Shostakovich revered by the government for his works? Shostakovich cared deeply about those who suffered, especially the Jewish communities. In 1948, he found a volume of Jewish folk poetry, translated into Russian, and had 11 of them in song cycle, and these were called From Jewish Folk Poetry. He used their folk music in his composition to show their resilience. This was a direct critique of the regime, and Stalin ain't taking that. Stalin's government was persecuting Jewish people at the time. Shostakovich's music stood as a quiet but powerful protest. He once said, Jewish folk music made a powerful impression on me. It can appear happy, when it is tragic. It is almost like a laughter through tears. It became a symbol for me. I tried to convey that feeling in my music. In 1960, Shostakovich was forced to join the Communist Party, a decision that deeply distressed him. Struggling emotionally, he contemplated ending his life and channeled his anguish into the 8th String Quartet, written in just 3 days. This piece is very dark and deeply personal. It was almost like a requiem. Or if you don't know, requiems basically like song composers would write when they're about to die for themselves. Like, for instance, Mozart, in his dying days, he wrote a requiem for himself, even though he didn't finish it. And we talked about his requiem in our first episode. You can go check it out in our link below. The first movement is slow and mournful, evoking a sense of death, while the frantic second movement reflects a fear and constant tension he lived under. In the 8th String Quartet, the first movement is so slow and dark, it just sounds like death. In the second movement, I also want to highlight that this is one of the reasons why I'm creating this episode in the first place. That's how I kind of got into classical music, kind of really got me into Shostakovich works and got me really interested in them. So I really recommend you check it out. But it's so frantic. It's like you're constantly under this pressure and it's like you're stepping on knives and you're almost afraid to like trigger the sleeping lion. You're living in constant fear, and you can just feel how Shostakovich felt by listening to this piece. In 1961, the poet Yevtushenko visited the site of the Babi massacre, where 37,000 Jews were murdered, and was shocked to find no memorial. His poem Babi brought attention to this injustice, and Shostakovich set it to music along with 4 other Yevtushenko poems in his 13th symphony. This symphony vividly portrays the horrors of the persecution and life under Stalin's terror and how the horrible conditions Jewish people faced. Despite the Soviet government's attempts to suppress it, the symphony premiered in 1962 and was later banned for 30 years. Through all attempts to silence him, Shostakovich never gave up and played the music of his heart. His music was his voice, and he fought his whole life to keep the fire of his soul and to keep his voice. Shostakovich's music speaks to everyone. It tells stories of pain and hope, of fighting against oppression and holding onto humanity, whether it is through his symphonies, operas, or chamber music. Shostakovich created works that connect with people on a deeply emotional level. His legacy reminds us of the power of art and to endure even in the hardest times. This is why Shostakovich is the greatest composer of all time. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Shostakovich and me talking about what a great hero he was. Your support means everything to me. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like this video, and let me know if there's anything that I missed out or miscommunicated. Stay tuned for more explorations into the world of classical music on Symphonic Stories, and keep listening and learning. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video. Bye!